The chains were heavy, and the iron shackles around his ankles left raw, bleeding marks against his skin. It was 1957. Dedan Kimathi, the man the colonial government called a terrorist, and his people called the field marshal, stood before a judge in a sterile, white-walled courtroom. He had been captured in the damp, dark hollows of the Aberdare forest, shot in the leg, and dragged from the only home he had known for years. In that room, the air was still. The judge spoke. The lawyers moved. And the heavy thud of the gavel echoed against the stone. Kimathi stood tall. His body was gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. His clothes tattered from the forest thorns. He did not beg. He did not plead. He simply watched, his eyes fixed on the room. He was a man who had commanded thousands in the trees. But here, he was surrounded by men who treated his life like a line of ink on a piece of paper. But to understand how a boy from the red-hot slopes of Nyeri became the man who stood in those shackles, we have to look back. In 1920, the world was much quieter. Kimathi was born into a landscape of green ridges and deep, cool mist. His parents were farmers. His early childhood was marked by the rhythm of the soil. The sharp, metallic scent of a hoe striking the ground, the morning chill that beat at his fingertips, and the smell of wood smoke curling from the roof of their homestead. As a boy, he walked the narrow paths between the maize fields. He carried his school books past the trees that would eventually become his fortress. In the classroom, he learned a new language and the rules of a colonial system that was slowly stretching its fingers across his home. He sat at a wooden desk, looking out at the mountains, unaware that the fences being built in his village were closing in on his future. The boy who learned to read in a colonial school had no way of knowing that the same government teaching him would one day hunt him through the forest, or that his name would eventually be whispered like a prayer by those who fought for the land he once helped his father farm. By the late 1930s, the world Kimathi walked through had changed. The village was no longer just about the rain and the harvest. It was about lines drawn on maps by people who had never stepped foot in the Central Highlands. Everywhere he looked, the landscape was being partitioned. Tall, barbed wire fences cut across the old footpaths. Large swaths of fertile land were registered as white highlands. For a young man coming of age, the pressure was in the daily encounters. Kimathi took a series of jobs, working on farms, running errands. In these years, the routine of his life was interrupted by constant, small indignities. He saw his neighbors forced to carry the keponda, a metal tag worn around the neck on a string. It was a heavy reminder that his movement was not his own. He was observant. He watched his father struggle to keep their small plot productive while taxes rose. The uncertainty grew. It wasn't one thunderous event. It was the slow, daily grinding of a system that made it impossible for a man to build a life on his own terms. He began to attend local meetings. He listened to the murmurs of the elders and the sharper, more frustrated talk of the younger men returning from the Second World War. The mist in the Aberdare still clung to the trees, but the air in the villages was becoming heavy. It was the quiet, steady hum of people who were tired of watching their world disappear. By the early 1950s, the tension in the Central Highlands became physical. The colonial government's response to growing unrest was to tighten its grip. Arrests became frequent. The atmosphere in the marketplaces shifted from the usual hum of trade to something guarded. Dedan Kimathi was moving between the villages and the fringes of the forest. Then, in October 1952, the state of emergency was declared. Overnight, the legal rules of the land changed. Thousands of soldiers were deployed. Entire villages were emptied. Their residents moved into detention camps or forced into guarded, fortified settlements. Kimathi saw his neighbors, people he had known since childhood, taken away in the backs of trucks. The homes he walked past every day were burned. He didn't walk into the forest as a general with a map. He walked into the forest as a man who had run out of ground to stand on. The Aberdare forest, a place of childhood shadows, now became his only protection. The trees were dense. The terrain was steep. He was joined by others, farmers who had lost their land, and laborers who had walked off the settler farms. They had no uniforms, very few weapons, only their knowledge of the landscape, and a shared belief in the soil beneath their feet. As the sun set behind the ridges, the forest grew cold. Kimathi stood among them, a man who had seen his world taken apart, and was now trying to piece together a future in the dark. Life in the Aberdare forest was defined by two things: hunger and the rain. By the mid-1950s, the forest was a world unto itself. It was a grueling, daily survival exercise. When the heavy mountain rains came, the paths turned into rivers of deep, sucking mud that clung to their boots. Their diet was meager: wild roots, scavenged crops. Many men grew thin, their clothes rotted by the constant dampness. The danger was constant. Planes flew low over the canopy, their engines vibrating the air, searching for any sign of movement below. Kimathi's role shifted from community organizer to a leader under pressure. He managed limited supplies, and faced the grim reality of a war where his side had few guns against a modern, organized military. There were no grand speeches in the dark of a rain-soaked night. There was only the sound of shivering, the crackle of a tiny, hidden fire, and the relentless, creeping fear of being found. Yet, in this isolation, a structure emerged. They established oaths of loyalty and a hierarchy to maintain order. They were caught between the crushing weight of the colonial state and the desperate, fading hope that they could force a change. The war was a war of exhaustion. By 1956, the Aberdares felt less like a fortress and more like a closing trap. The supply lines were cut. The fighters were starving. Dedan Kimathi found himself increasingly isolated. His health was failing. The constant exposure to the cold mist, the lack of food, and the unrelenting stress had taken their toll. The end came not in a climactic, heroic battle, but in the quiet, damp darkness of a mountain path. In October 1956, a local patrol spotted him. There was a brief, sharp burst of gunfire. A bullet struck him in the leg. He was captured, bleeding and unable to move, on the very soil he had spent years trying to reclaim. For the colonial government, it was a tactical victory. For the people in the villages, it was a moment of profound, quiet grief. He was moved to a prison in the capital. The man who had walked the red earth paths as a free farmer was now held in a cell. The trial was short. When he stood in that courtroom, his voice was steady. But he was a man standing at the very end of his path. The forest remained behind him, silent and indifferent. The gallows at Kimathi prison in February 1957 were cold and silent. The colonial government buried Dedan Kimathi in an unmarked grave, hoping to ensure that no one would know where to look. They acted as if a life could be erased by burying it in silence. But history is not just what is recorded on paper. It is what is carried in the memory of a people. Even while his grave remained hidden, Kimathi's name was spoken in the quiet corners of homes, and in the fields where people worked the soil. Today, the fences are gone. The Aberdare forest is a place where people go to work and to breathe. What remains of Dedan Kimathi? The mystery of his final resting place haunted the national consciousness for decades. A physical manifestation of a story that refused to be finished. When we look back at the man who walked out of the classroom and into the shadows of the forest, we are looking at a life that forces us to ask, what is the price of freedom? What is the weight of a man who chooses to lose everything, so that those who follow might own the land they stand on? Dedan Kimathi remains in the questions that every generation must ask itself. Who are we? And what are we willing to defend? This is The African Archive. If these stories matter to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the next chapter of Africa's remarkable past. The archive is never closed. We'll see you in the next story.